Hey, what's up, everybody? Today we're looking at The Telltale Brain, a neuroscientist's quest for what makes us human by V.S. Ramachandran, MD and neuroscientist, and he's the director of the Center for Brain and Cognition in San Diego. Ramachandran specializes in vision, phantom limbs, and synesthesia. He's been called the Marco Polo of neuroscience for his work. He diagnoses patients with rare neurological disorders and figures out ways to alleviate or even cure their suffering. And this is the main thing that blows me away with this guy. V.S. Ramachandran has been an important part of my learning interests. I first read The Telltale Brain a few years ago, along with three other books by V.S. Ramachandran: Phantoms in the Brain, A Brief Tour of Consciousness, and The Emerging Mind. And I said to myself back then, this guy is my favorite author, and it takes a lot for me to say that I have a favorite of something. That's a term that I try to take seriously. But Ramachandran's books inspired me to want to learn like no other author ever had, and they specifically made me want to learn about how the brain works because I want to better my understanding of nature, and a big part of trying to understand nature is trying to understand the neurological hardware that is the thing doing the understanding. So I think it's a good idea to study the brain. And that's a theme that you can't help but consider when you read a book like this. Anyway, back when I first read Ramachandran's books, I hadn't yet read other authors on the human brain. Since then, I've read a lot of books and experienced many wonderful authors. So I wanted to see, if I reread one of his books, what would it be like? Would he still be my favorite author? Before I answer that, let's review his book, The Telltale Brain. I really like the title for this book. Obviously, a reference for the Edgar Allan Poe story, The Telltale Heart, but it has significant meaning that underlies Ramachandran's work as a neuroscientist. It means that there is an observable physical basis for neurological disorders. Books like this demonstrate that there is a logical explanation. It's just a matter of discovering it. We don't have to make wild, unfalsifiable speculations like Sigmund Freud. I think the best way to review The Telltale Brain would be to start by explaining one of my favorite anecdotes from the book. Also, I put a link in the description to a talk that he gave years ago. The video very accurately captures what his books are about, and I love it. And he's got the greatest accent ever. I highly recommend you check out that video if you're interested in the human brain. Okay, so The Telltale Brain. Some of the disorders Ramachandran sheds light on were things the cause of which psychologists have concocted some pretty brilliant explanations, but as it turns out, there are physically based reasons for some of the disorders, and that usually comes down to a lesion or some malady in specific structures in the brain. And it's incredible the amount of what makes you you can be altered by changes in your neural hardware. Some things are obvious, like if you have a tumor disrupting a portion of the brain where a growth hormone is manufactured, it's reasonable to assume that the mediation of that hormone will be disrupted in one way or another. But the brain doesn't just relay reality to us, it actively constructs our reality. It's easy to take our perceptions for granted, but it's all a product of complex neural interactions, and things can go wrong. We have areas in our brain important for constructing our perception of motion, vertical lines, horizontal lines, edge detection, face recognition, etc. So, damage to particular areas can have bizarre and very specific, and most importantly for this book, very revealing effects. Sometimes we have to consider what other areas of the brain, how they play a part in a particular perception. The fusiform gyrus is the neural structure most important for face recognition. So if I look at a person, information travels from the retina to the fusiform gyrus and up to higher processing areas. One of those higher areas is the amygdala, where the perception will be assigned its emotional significance. If I'm looking at something trivial like a cup, there will be no emotional significance assigned to my perceptual experience. But if I'm looking at a face, especially the face of a loved one, there will be. And As it happens, this is something that can be measured through skin conductance using galvanic skin response measuring. One of the disorders in this book is Capgras syndrome, which is when you look at the face of a loved one and you're convinced that they're some kind of imposter. If I have damage somewhere in the circuit between my fusiform gyrus and the amygdala, I can't properly assign the emotional significance to that face, and the brain's only explanation in its construction of the perception is that the person is an imposter. But voice recognition takes a totally different path to reach the amygdala, so if that person leaves the room and calls me on the phone, I'll immediately recognize them as if I never had brain damage. If not, then I'd assume that the brain damage was in the amygdala itself rather than somewhere along the visual path to it. Capgras syndrome is just one of the many neurological disorders Ramachandran talks about in The Telltale Brain. Some of the disorders discussed in this book are pretty mind-blowing, like apotemnophilia or Cotard syndrome. Those are both worth a Google search. And with these disorders, Ramachandran always links them to areas in the brain that are involved. It's not demonic possession, it's not divine retribution. These are real neurological disorders, and as such, they have a real cause. So you see why the book is called A Telltale Brain. More than any other book, I think The Telltale Brain and Phantoms in the Brain caused me to see some of the brain's roles in a different way. It made me ask, to what degree could neuroscience replace psychology, or could psychology be relegated to a subcategory of neuroscience? Ramachandran specializes in synesthesia and brain-body mapping. This is when there is a specific kind of disagreement between sensation and perception, and some of the results you can get are things like tasting numbers, or numbers having a specific color, or seeing music. His other specialty is phantom limb delusions, when an amputee still feels their missing limb, and oftentimes that includes phantom pain. And this is just as real a perception as ordinary pain, because that's what their brain is telling them. One of Ramachandran's contributions to medicine was discovering how to treat things like phantom pain. It's an amazing thing to read about. The Telltale Brain also talks at length about mirror neurons. These neurons are said to be what allow us to empathize by allowing us to create models of other people's minds and our thoughts. Ramachandran discusses how the evolution of the inferior parietal lobule may have played a major role in the great leap forward in Homo sapiens. The inferior parietal lobule is rich in mirror neurons and is involved with higher process functions like language, introspection, self-body image awareness, and multimodal sensory integration. That means that it may be important for one of humanity's greatest traits, the ability to engage in metaphoric abstractions. Ramachandran speculates on mirror neurons' relation to disorders like autism and apraxia, among others. The Telltale Brain is a book that anyone can relate to because we all have the same kind of brain constructing our realities. A deeper takeaway from the book is that what makes us us is completely dependent upon the proper functioning of our brains. We can even elicit certain perceptions, memories, and visions simply by stimulating certain areas of the brain using transcranial magnetic stimulation. This has major implications for concepts like free will and what the brain is and can do. Of course, it's not as simple as just each area of the brain has specific function. The complexity of the brain reminds me of how genes can work. Rather than simply, this area of the brain does this, communication between different areas of the brain seems to have emergent properties. Ramachandran uses the analogy of a phase shift with ice at below and above freezing temperatures for thinking about emergent properties in the brain. And this really gets you thinking about what else could our brains be capable of if certain connections were to exist. So that's The Telltale Brain. How do I feel after rereading this book? Is V.S. Ramachandran still my favorite author? Well, as much as I love this book, I'm not sure I can say that I have a favorite author. That's something that can change depending on my mood, and there are so many subjects I'm interested in. But this author is the one most directly responsible for making me fall in love with learning about the brain. I can say that having read quite a few authors on the brain, no one else has delivered the way Ramachandran does, with how he actually discusses the functions for the different areas of the brain. That's something that I've been looking for in books ever since reading him, and it's not very easy to find. There are some authors that I've been pretty impressed with, like David Eagleman. Lisa Feldman Barrett is really good, and of course, Oliver Sacks is always good. I need to reread Phantoms in the Brain. That was my first Ramachandran book, and really that's the one that first blew me away. It may be his best book. It's older than The Telltale Brain, though. Phantoms in the Brain was published in 1998, and The Telltale Brain was published in 2011. Okay, that's it for this one, guys. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. Guys, if you're interested in the human brain, you gotta check out V.S. Ramachandran. There's that link in the description. Awesome video. If you've heard of this guy, let me know. I'd be curious to hear what people think. I've never met anybody that's heard of him before. If you haven't and you want to learn about the brain, definitely check out The Telltale Brain by V.S. Ramachandran.